Hey, this is Rick Kasalich, injury specialist from exercisesforinjuries.com. In today's video, I wanted to go through a few hamstring stretches for flexibility. And I'm going to get Jenna to go through them, and she'll end up going through the first one. Then I'll go through in detail, and I'll show you the other ones that you need to do. Good, there you go. It ends up being the walkouts. Perfect. So we'll go from the start. We'll go, so you're in a standing position. You're going to squat down. Okay, and then you're going to walk out, almost like into that plank position, and then you're going to walk back and kind of go into a pike position to a point where you're ending up getting a stretch in those hamstrings. So hamstrings might carry on to the glute, and then you're walking back out. So this one ends up being a little bit different. It ends up being a dynamic stretch that we're working on. So you're going to do 5 repetitions. You're going to a point where you're feeling that light stretch, holding it for a couple seconds, then moving out of that stretch, and then moving back in with the walkouts. Looking at the sets, reps, and time, sets end up being 1, repetitions end up being 5, time ends up being a smooth, controlled movement, and coming to a good stop at the end position, like 2 to 3 second hold at the end position. The intensity ends up being light. You're looking at a light stretch. We're not trying to rip apart the hamstring muscle. That ends up being the first flexibility exercise or hamstring stretch. Moving on to the second one, this one ends up being deep squat into a forward fold. Good. Good. So we'll go off in the starting position. So going to standing. So you're going to separate the feet a little wider. You're going to go into a deep squat position. You're going to grab the front of your toes, and then you're going to bring your hips up, straightening out the legs, going to that point where you're feeling a stretch in those hamstrings, and then you're going to offload, and then you're going to go into that stretch again. Perfect. So this one ends up being, once again, more of like a dynamic stretch that we're working on, and the hold only ends up being for a couple seconds. So looking at the sets, reps, time, and intensity, sets end up being 1, repetitions end up being 5, time ends up being smooth, controlled movement with a good stop at the end position. I would say 2 to 3 seconds at that end position. The intensity ends up being light. We're looking at stretching out that hamstring, and it might even carry on into the glute area. That ends up being the second one. Moving on to the third one, it ends up being the rocking half lunge. So we're moving into a lunge position, straightening out the leg, and then straightening out that good, and then bending forward in order to increase the intensity, and then offloading that bend again, going into that 90-90 position, and then moving back into that hamstring stretch. You can bend forward through the waist in order to intensify the stretch, and then offloading again, and then back into that hamstring stretch and bending forward in order to increase the intensity. This one, once again, ends up being more of like a dynamic stretch that we're working on. Looking at the sets, reps, time, and intensity, sets end up being 1, repetitions end up being 5, time ends up being smooth, controlled movement with a good stop at the end position, 2 to 3 seconds, and the intensity ends up being light. We're looking at lightly stretching that hamstring area, and it may carry on into the glutes. Now moving into the last one, the fourth and the last one, this ends up being hamstring stretch with band. So you're going to move down to the floor, looping the tubing around your foot. Good, you're going to lay down, bring that leg up. So the opposite leg is bent, puts your back into a good position, and then your leg's up in the air, and you're pulling the tubing towards you and bringing that leg back as much as you can, and then also trying to stretch out that leg as much as you can in order to target that hamstring area. And once again, hamstring might carry on into the glute. Looking at this one, when it relates to sets, reps, time, and intensity, it's a little different than the other one. This one ends up being a static stretch. So we're looking at when it comes to sets, reps, time, and intensity, sets end up being 1, repetitions end up being 2, alternating back and forth. Time ends up being 20 seconds. Intensity ends up being light. We're targeting that hamstring and glute area. So there you go. That ends up being 4 hamstring stretches for flexibility. Give those a go if you want to end up improving the flexibility of your hamstrings. Now, if you are suffering from hip pain and you want some of my best tips and tricks when it relates to hip pain, what I recommend you do is click right here. I have a brand new free report called 5 Tricks That Fight Hip Pain and Tightness. Click right here, let me know where to send it to, and I'll send it to you right away. Now, if you're watching this on a tablet, smartphone, head down below in the description and click the first link, which will end up being exercisesforinjuries.com/hips. Let me know where to send that report, and I'll send you that report right away. Now, if you have a question or comment for me, leave it down below in the comment section. If you got benefit from this video, make sure to like this video. And lastly, hit subscribe in order to get future pain relieving videos.